Hi, this is Professor Allison Liu with Public Health 100 at Carolina University, and this is Lecture J, our Food Safety and Global Nutrition lecture, and then we're going to do an exam review that will help you on your final exam. So let's start with food safety. We're just going to cover a few topics about food safety. Food can be contaminated with causes of illness, and that probably doesn't come to as a shock to anyone. And there's ways to prevent these illnesses. Two ways to prevent the illnesses is through regulation and industry standards. We'll talk about some others as we go along. So causes of illness that may be present in food include bacteria. An example of that is salmonella. Viruses, an example of that is norovirus. Parasitic protozoa, an example of that is Cryptosporidium. And molds, an example of that is Aspergillus. Now be aware that not all bacteria are harmful to us, not all molds are harmful to us. It depends on what kind of an agent we're dealing with. But for example, E. coli live in our intestinal tract and are supposed to be there and help us. But if we get salmonella in our intestinal tract, it'll make us sick. So let's talk about viruses for a moment. We'll just use them as an example. So when viruses enter the human body, viruses that cause disease, let's say we eat a raw oyster that is contaminated with a virus. The virus travels through the gastrointestinal tract and attaches to the mucosal cell in the small intestine. The virus enters the mucosal cell and transfers its genetic material. The virus uses the cell's metabolic machinery to make a copy of the virus. And then the cells infected are damaged and continue to release new copies of the virus, which then infects more mucosal cells, which then become basically little virus factories. So this is what a virus does when it infects a human. It's taking our cells and turning them into little virus factories. And then they're damaged to the point of no return. And what our body does is then fight off the viruses. It figures out how to fight them better and better until it wins the battle. There are several agencies involved in the protection of public health related to food. There's the USDA, which is responsible for the agricultural products. There's the FDA, which is responsible for foods. The CDC, which is responsible for controlling and preventing illness. And then the EPA, which is responsible for the protection of the environment. And they make decisions about things like what pesticides are going to be allowed, or if there's a problem with cattle and their environment, something in the environment affecting the cattle, they may be involved in something like that. So those are all government agencies, the ones on that previous slide. Now we're going to talk about an industry standard, okay, the standards within the food industry. There's something called Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points. A Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points, or HACCP, is a program within the food industry designed to promote food safety and prevent contamination by identifying all areas in food production and retail where contamination could occur. So the USDA requires that the food industry follow HACCP for meat and poultry, while the FDA requires it for seafood, low-acid canned foods, and juice. And the HACCP is voluntary for all other food products, but its main goal is to prevent contamination at all costs. Now, a cynical person might say, well, the food industry is just kind of trying to keep the government from regulating it more. And that's probably true. But it's also true that the food industry does not benefit from people getting sick from food. In fact, it hurts the food industry. So they have every interest in making sure that food is safe as well. So it's both. They probably do want to avoid further government regulation, but they also want to make sure that food is safe and healthy because it goes back on them and the industry is blamed when something goes wrong a lot of times. So here are the 7 steps to HACCP. First, you conduct a hazard analysis. The manufacturer must first determine any food safety hazards biological, chemical, or physical, and identify preventative measures to control the hazards. Second, they must identify the critical control points, or CCP. It's a point or procedure in food manufacturing where control can be applied to prevent or eliminate food hazards that may cause the food to be unsafe. Number 3, to establish critical limits. The critical limit is the maximum or minimum value that a food hazard must be controlled at a CCP to prevent, eliminate, or reduce it to an acceptable level. So let's say you are producing a product and it could be contaminated with something. You would establish this critical control point and test and see if everything is okay, if you're meeting the standard or not. That's the critical limit, okay? Fourth, establish monitoring requirements. That's how you're going to find out if you're at the CCP. The manufacturer must establish procedures to monitor the control points to ensure the process is under control and not above the CCP. So they have to establish this monitoring requirement, okay? They have to be doing monitoring all the time. 5, establish corrective actions. Corrective actions are needed when monitoring indicates a deviation from the established critical limit to ensure that no produce injurious to health has occurred as a result of the deviation. So they've got to take corrective actions when any of their testing shows that there's a problem. Number 6 is establish verification procedures. So verification ensures that the HACCP plan is adequate with CCP records, critical limits, and microbial sampling and analysis. And then number 7, record-keeping procedure. The manufacturer must maintain certain documents, including its hazard analysis, HACCP plan, and records monitoring the CCP, critical limits, and the verification of handling process deviations. So one might ask, why do we even need HACCP? Well, one reason we need HACCP is because the amount of inspection that the government is actually doing of our food is pretty minimal. So HACCP is a way to kind of extend the monitoring process. It is conducted by the industry itself, by manufacturers, but it's a way to extend the inspection process because honestly, the government agencies are really not able to do much of they're not doing enough, I guess you could say, of verification and inspection. So this puts the onus on the industry to do more. Okay, so what about preventing illness from the consumer's role? So where are the consumers? What can we do to prevent illness? General steps. We want to clean. Wash hands thoroughly, clean surfaces often, and wash utensils after each use, and then wash fruits and vegetables even if you plan to peel them. Separate. Do not cross-contaminate food during preparation and storage. Use separate cutting boards for produce and then for meat, poultry, seafood, and eggs. And store food products separately in the refrigerator. You don't want products that are intended for raw consumption to be in contact with raw meat, for example. They can't be cross-contaminated because if they are, you could get something like salmonella in your salad. Cook. Heat food to proper temperatures. Use a food thermometer to check the temperature of food while it is cooking. Keep food hot after it has been cooked. So many people try to rely on what food looks like instead of a food thermometer. And while those can give some clues, the food thermometer is far more accurate. And if you check the temperature, the internal temperature of meat, for example, you can be very sure that it's cooked thoroughly. If you're just looking to see if it's cooked thoroughly, that's far, far less accurate. Then you want to chill. Refrigerate any leftovers within 2 hours. Never thaw or marinate food on the counter. So you don't want to put your meat out on the counter to thaw out if it's frozen. You want to only do that in the refrigerator. It does take longer, but it's much safer. If you're going to marinate some meat in some kind of sauce, you want to do that in the refrigerator as well. A lot of times, one of the issues that happens with the chilling of food is if we go to a party or we have a get-together for a holiday, people will leave the food out a very long time, much longer than they normally would. And so that can create the potential for foodborne illness, and then everybody gets sick after Thanksgiving, or everybody gets sick after Christmas, or everybody gets sick after New Year's, or whatever kind of party it is, a birthday party. They'll get sick because of the leftovers being out for 4 hours, 5 hours, and being eaten during that time. It really isn't safe to do that. It needs to be put in the refrigerator within 2 hours. So we want to take precautions during key parts of the process when we're buying food, storing food, preparing food, cooking food, and serving food. Here is a link to the part of your textbook that talks about each one of these, but I'm going to give you a few examples. So when we're buying food, we want to look for problems. If the meat packaging is open and it's been exposed to whatever in the grocery store, you don't even know what it's been exposed to because the plastic packaging is partially removed, that wouldn't be a very safe product to take home and then consume. If you come across a can that has a bulge, that could represent bacteria that could lead to something called botulism, which is very, very dangerous, so you would not want to use that. The grocery store doesn't want you using it either. They're going to throw it away if they see it. So definitely don't use a canned product that could have a contaminant like that. Storing food. Oh, another thing you can do to try to make sure that you never get botulism is when a can is opened, you should hear that sound. The sound that it's that you're breaking the vacuum, that the seal is being broken, that it was under pressure. If you don't hear that sound, then maybe the can was not properly closed and you could have gotten contamination. Storing food. So we want to store food properly. When we get home from the grocery store, we want to put the food that needs to be refrigerated in the refrigerator, for example. Storing leftovers within 2 hours is very important. Preparing food. When we're preparing food, we want to use proper technique, no cross-contamination. When we're cooking food, using that food thermometer. Serving food, we want to make sure we serve food hot or cold. Another way to do that is you can actually have something like a crock pot or some kind of warming device to keep the food hot. That can actually help a lot with decreasing foodborne illness, or keeping the food cold, so you keep things on ice. That can also help. And there's whole sections about each of those, but just think about at each stage how you can help prevent and decrease foodborne illness. Also, hand washing is really important. Hand washing helps to decrease all kinds of illness, and also it is law that all food service workers have to wash their hands when they use the restroom. Everyone should be washing their hands before they start cooking, serving, or being around food, because that helps to decrease any foodborne illness. All right, food additives. Let's talk about those for a minute. So there's regulations about food additives. The FDA works to protect the public from potentially dangerous additives. And in 1958, the Food Additives Amendment stated that the manufacturer is responsible for demonstrating the safety of an additive before it can be approved. The Delaney Clause was also added, and this legislation prohibits the approval of any additive found to cause cancer in animals or humans. However, most additives are considered to be generally recognized as safe, which is abbreviated GRAS. So here's some examples of food additives. You may wonder, why would anybody even use a food additive? Like, what is the point? Well, a lot of the additives are intended to increase the shelf life of food, to improve its appearance or its taste. There's reasons we put these in our food. So let's take a few examples from this list. Let's take citric acid. It's for increasing tartness and to prevent the food from becoming rancid. Also, it tastes kind of good. If you've ever had Sour Patch Kids, the stuff on the outside of the Sour Patch Kids candy is citric acid. Some people really like the taste. Let's take MSG as an example. That's called monosodium glutamate. It enhances the flavor of a variety of foods. What about pectin? Pectin gives candies and jams a gel-like texture. How about sulfites? Sulfites prevent discoloration of dried fruit, so they're much more pleasant to eat if they're the color we think they should be. Beta-carotene adds artificial coloring to food. It has a yellow or kind of orange color. So there's a lot of reasons that we might add things to foods. Modified food starch is used to keep ingredients from separating and prevents lumps. So it makes things more pleasant to eat a lot of times. So food additives aren't always beneficial though. Some substances have been associated with certain diseases if consumed in large amounts. For example, the FDA estimates that sulfites can cause allergic reactions in 1% of the general population and in 5% of asthmatics. Similarly, the additive monosodium glutamate, which is commonly known as MSG, may cause headaches, nausea, weakness, difficulty breathing, rapid heart rate, and chest pain in some individuals. Now, most people tolerate MSG just fine, but there is a subset of individuals who cannot tolerate it. All right, so there is a lot more information in your book about food additives. There's some section about irradiating food, which is interesting. So I would encourage you to look over the chapter if you haven't already done so. And now we're going to talk just a moment about global nutrition. This is just going to be really fast because we want to get to our exam review. So touching on a few issues about global nutrition. It's really a small world. We are more connected than we ever have been. Foods are being grown in one part of the world and then shipped to the other side of the world for consumption in many cases. So this is relatively new. In the past, the not too distant past, most people were eating foods that were grown in their region, even grown locally. They were not eating foods from very far away. And when we do eat locally, we decrease the cost of growing food in many ways because we don't have the transportation costs. And we're eating local foods, which helps our local economies. And so there's some benefits to eating local. However, there's foods that we can't get where we live. For example, if you live in Massachusetts, you're not going to be able to get oranges in the winter. Oranges grow in Florida and California and places like that. They don't grow in Massachusetts, and they certainly don't grow in Massachusetts in the winter. So if you want oranges, you're going to have to get them from a different region. So it helps us to be able to get these varieties of food from other places, but it also incurs a lot of costs, transportation costs and whatnot. And then there's also differences in regional, what pesticides are allowed, what regulations are applied. And so there can be differences in different countries, for example, and what's allowed to be on a farm, what regulations are taking place about how food is grown. And so there's an impact from that of food safety being compromised in some cases. Or, maybe there's a pesticide that we allow in the United States, but they don't allow in Western Europe, or that they allow in South America, but we don't allow it in the United States, and things like that. That they allow in Asia, but we don't allow it here, or vice versa. Somewhere it says no to that. France says we can't use that pesticide, but when we take food over there and sell it, it has been exposed to that pesticide. So there's all kinds of differences of opinion about what should be allowed and not allowed. And when we share food, when we send food from one place to another, we're kind of breaking all those lines a lot of times. Then there's global change. There's things like storms, climate change, wildfires, hurricanes, places where there's too much rain and the crops are ruined, places where there's too little rain and the crops don't grow. There's often a problem with growing something or raising something somewhere in the world, and these cause shortages and economic problems and distress. So the whole region can be affected, and then other parts of the world may try to assist and should assist, but there's often problems with growing and producing food that affect regions and then eventually the whole world if it's a big enough problem. Hunger is a major problem. Hunger affects many children. It affects children very severely because they're growing and they're vulnerable. And there are a large number of children in the world that are still dying of hunger. And every country has at least some hunger problems. No one's solved the problems completely. And we definitely have hunger issues in the United States today. But in the rest of the world, in many places, the hunger problems are much worse. And so those are challenges that we are trying to deal with as a world on a daily and yearly basis to try to decrease the problem of hunger. And some of the things we do to grow food, to produce food, will impact that. So some foods require a lot to produce. For example, if you want to produce beef, that requires a lot of effort. It's expensive. It requires a lot of land. It requires a lot of feed for the cattle, etc. If you want to grow rice, that requires a lot of water. So there's costs with any food we grow or produce. And we should always be looking at ways to produce food better, but always keeping in mind the consequences of the improvements we make or the unintended consequences of the changes we make as well. So we're all just so connected. And so I just want to point out some of these issues as you go forward and you learn more about cultures, you learn more about nutrition, you learn more about science. Keep in mind that we are so interconnected, and nutrition is one of the many ways we are. All right, let's go ahead and do our final exam review. So we're going to go through a few questions and answers. Hyperkalemia is high blood potassium. How do you know that? Well, the hyper part stands for high. Hyper always means high, and hypo means low. And kalemia means potassium. So we've got high blood potassium is hyperkalemia. Hyponatremia is low blood sodium. So hypo means low, natremia stands for sodium. So this is low sodium. How does one get hyponatremia? Do you remember that? Hyponatremia can be caused by something called water intoxication, when someone actually drinks so much water that it's dangerous to them. There are other causes of hyponatremia, including some medications can cause it. But one way to get hyponatremia is when you ingest an incredibly large amount of water. Sometimes happens to marathon runners, and it has happened in other circumstances as well. But it can be very dangerous. People can get seizures. They actually can have cells burst due to this ingestion of water, and it can actually kill you. It usually kills you because of swelling in your brain. But that's pretty rare. And you would actually have to try pretty hard to drink this amount of water or be in some kind of circumstances that were just very unusual, such as the marathon runners. They're just an incredible challenge to their body, and they're drinking water kind of compulsively because of that challenge, and that's how they end up with the hyponatremia. Foods high in simple sugars have a high glycemic index. The glycemic index basically tells you how fast the sugar is going to be released, how much sugar is going to be released with this food. So high glycemic indexes, something like a Coca-Cola would have a really high glycemic index, right? It's high in simple sugars. Something like chicken breast, low glycemic index, right? Because it doesn't have those simple sugars. Humans grow fastest during what stage? That's adolescence. However, humans' brains grow fastest during what stage? Humans' brains grow fastest during infancy. How often do newborns eat? Newborns eat 8 to 12 times a day, very frequently. Besides breastfeeding, the only other appropriate food for newborns is infant formula. It's not okay to give infants cow's milk, goat's milk, soy milk, or any other kind of milk. The only appropriate type of milk for babies is human breast milk or commercially prepared infant formula, which is made to mimic human breast milk. So today, most adults die of what? Heart disease. Remember, in the past, more died of infectious diseases. But today, most adults in the United States, for sure, die of heart disease. Diet that helps high blood pressure. That is called the DASH diet. The DASH diet is low in sodium, okay? In the past, people were more concerned about, and the blank, people were more physically active. I'm sorry, I skipped to the next question. People were more physically active in the past, okay? Remember how we talked about in the past, people were physically active because they had to be in order to survive. Today, people are less physically active. In the past, people were also concerned about getting enough food. So they were more concerned about that instead of being concerned about obesity like we are today because we have high obesity rates, right? So these are trends that are relatively new. Most of our nutrients should come from what? Foods, not supplements. Foods first is the quotation you'll hear about that. Foods first. So most of our nutrients should not be coming from supplements. It should be coming from food. This age group is associated with picky eating. Well, any preschool teacher can tell you that toddlerhood is associated with picky eating. Toddlers don't have a very adventurous spirit about their eating. They tend to be very picky. Totally breastfed babies eventually need blank supplement. The answer to that question is iron. So eventually babies will need about 6 months or so. They're going to need iron supplementation either with an iron supplement drop or a multivitamin supplement drop like Polyvisol, or they're going to need infant cereal that's fortified with iron, okay? And that's because they simply cannot get enough iron from breast milk after that. Newborns get blank shots to help their blood clot. Those are vitamin K shots. Newborns don't have vitamin K when they're born. They need some, so we give them a vitamin K shot, and some parents are very suspicious of this shot, but it's to prevent bleeding in the newborn. We definitely don't want them to have bleeding that's not controlled with clotting, and the most dangerous type of bleeding that could be is bleeding into the brain. A brain hemorrhage can cause brain damage and be very detrimental. So we'll give them this vitamin K and try to prevent any problems like that. This group is very high risk for bone loss, okay? There's several risk factors for bone loss, but the biggest one that we've talked about in this class is women at or after menopause, because they rapidly lose bone mass at that stage of life. The good cholesterol is HDL. You want it to be high when you have a lipid panel. The bad cholesterol is LDL. You want it to be low when you have a lipid panel drawn. These are blood tests. Unhealthy fat to avoid is trans fats. You don't want to eat any trans fats if you can avoid them. You can't avoid them completely, probably, not in a modern diet around here, but you want to eat as few as possible. Another fat that we should reduce, because most of us are getting too much of it, is saturated fat. Saturated fats are associated with heart disease, and we want to reduce heart disease because it's the major killer. Diseases associated with high blood sugar. The disease associated with high blood sugar is diabetes. The food program that helps the elderly is called Meals on Wheels. And remember that this program not only provides senior citizens with food, but it also decreases their isolation, because when someone comes to their house for the Meals on Wheels program to deliver the food, they do so daily, a lot of times. Maybe they'll bring extra food on Fridays for the weekend, but they come to their house frequently, and that means that they're getting contact with other people, even if they live a very isolated life, and that contact with other people really helps elderly people do well and to thrive. So not only does the Meals on Wheels program provide food, it provides contact with other people and decreases isolation. This food program is for pregnant women and kids, preschool age kids specifically. That's the WIC program, and it stands for Women, Infants, and Children, and it's intended to help women, infants, and children get enough protein and other nutrients that the program wants to make sure that they get for proper growth and development. So it focuses on those things that we're afraid they might not get enough of: protein, calcium, supplements their calories. Food program for low-income people is called SNAP. It used to be called food stamps. Now it's called SNAP, and that's the program that pays for groceries and food for low-income individuals who qualify. Okay, let's talk about some agencies that are involved with nutrition. We have the CDC, which is the Disease Control Agency, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And then we have the Food and Drug Agency, also a government agency, which is in charge of foods and drugs, Food and Drug Administration. Then we have the Agency for Dietetics, which is a private organization called the American Dietetic Association. We have the agency that prevents birth defects and is involved in research and education for doing that. That's called the March of Dimes. So that one helps with birth defects. Pregnant women need to get enough folic acid because it prevents neural tube defects. So if you're asked a question about folic acid or neural tube defects, those go together. If a population has women in it, women of childbearing age who are getting enough folic acid, then that will decrease the neural tube defect rate, which is really good because neural tube defects cause some pretty severe disabilities sometimes, and we don't want that to happen. The government did start putting folic acid in grain products in the 1990s to try to make sure women were getting enough folic acid, but women are still recommended to take a multivitamin every day to try to make sure they get enough of folic acid and other micronutrients. Menstruating women need adequate this vitamin and this mineral to prevent anemia. Well, that's vitamin C and iron. And why do menstruating women sometimes get anemia? It's because the bleeding of menstruation can be enough that it decreases their ability to maintain proper iron stores. Basically, they develop iron deficiency anemia. And if they get enough iron in their diet and they get vitamin C in their diet to help them absorb the iron, it could counteract that. People with this substance abuse disorder frequently have nutritional deficiencies. Okay, so the substance abuse disorder that's frequently associated with nutritional deficiencies is alcohol use disorder, sometimes called alcoholism. And this problem, basically, the alcohol does have calories in it, so they're getting some calories from the alcohol, but they're substituting those calories for other calories that they would have gotten elsewhere, and so they're not getting enough of the micronutrients, and so they can develop very severe nutritional deficiencies. Our water is supplemented with fluoride to keep our teeth healthy. Children are especially at risk for problems if they do not have enough fluoride, so we put it in the water to try to make sure that they get enough. So micronutrients are, remember this, vitamins and minerals. Macronutrients are proteins, carbs, fats, and then some textbooks include alcohol as a micronutrient, but we don't have to have alcohol. We do have to have proteins, carbs, and fats. Alcohol is optional. We don't have to have it to survive. Starvation diseases include marasmus and kwashiorkor. Marasmus is a disease that causes emaciated states. People don't have fat stores. They basically are using other tissues in the body to provide energy. The body starts breaking down a protein like muscle, and this is not good at all. And eventually the person will succumb to starvation in this state. Kwashiorkor is a specific problem where someone is not getting enough protein. You know, marasmus are not getting enough calories for sure. Kwashiorkor, they have a low protein diet in addition to not getting enough calories, and that causes a very specific starvation disease situation where they have ascites of the belly, and that's just fluid that's going to, the fluid there's not enough albumin in the blood, not enough protein in the blood, and so you'll get this ascites in the abdomen, which causes the swelling, and so it'll look like they have kind of a swelling there in the belly, but they're starving to death, and so the people will eventually succumb to kwashiorkor. Both of these affect children a lot when there's a situation where there's not enough food in an area. The children, because they're growing, really suffer from starvation illnesses quickly and will succumb to that. Kwashiorkor is so called because it means rejected one, and it's often occurring in children who have been weaned from breast milk, and they are put on kind of a low protein diet because that was the only thing available, and you know, especially if there's not a lot of food around. And then because they're not getting the breast milk anymore, they're just not properly nourished, and that's usually because there's another baby born. So there's another baby born that's now being fed the breast milk, and there's not enough for both. So anyway, it's a very sad situation, and often children will succumb to this disease process, kwashiorkor. All right, so our bodies make this vitamin when exposed to sunlight. That one's vitamin D. We can make vitamin D when we're exposed to sunlight. Fat distribution pattern with an increased heart disease risk is the apple shape. The pear shape is the one associated with less heart disease risk. Phospholipids make up our cell membranes. Remember how we talked about the cell membrane is semi-permeable, and the reason for that is these phospholipids form a layer where the heads and the tails are facing in such a way that creates this semi-permeable membrane. And there's a picture of it in your textbook if you'd like to go back and look at that. This macronutrient is especially important for healing tissue. We've talked about that several times in the class, that's protein, that you need proper protein intake to have wound healing or to heal tissue. So if somebody has surgery or they break a leg or something, you want to make sure they have enough protein so they can reform tissue. These omega-3 fatty acids are added to baby formula. That's DHA and EPA. These were added to baby formula just in the last couple of decades to try to make the baby formula more like breast milk. As we try really hard to make that baby formula as much like breast milk as we can. Hormones that help us to use carbohydrate. This is a hormone called insulin, very famous hormone, and it helps our bodies move glucose into our cells. In this disease, the pancreas doesn't make enough insulin. That is type 1 diabetes, which usually occurs in children or very young adults. And it's a disease where the pancreas, the cells that produce insulin in the pancreas have been destroyed. And so the person does not make insulin anymore. And it has to be replaced, so they need insulin to survive. This is a disease where the body is resistant to insulin. Type 2 diabetes is that disease. So you can think of it as a disease where the body is not sensitive enough to insulin anymore. It's associated with overweight or obesity. It's very common it's starting to be common in younger people too, but it's very common in middle-aged people and above. And, it has a lot of different treatments. Which type of diabetes needs treatment, type 1 or type 2? It's a little bit of a trick question because both types actually need treatment. It's important to control diabetes because if your blood sugar is too high, it leads to all kinds of problems in your body. Primarily, it damages your vascular system, and that leads to heart disease, stroke, kidney disease, all kinds of problems, peripheral vascular disease. It can really take a toll on the body. So diabetes is very important to control. It doesn't matter if it's type 1 or type 2, it needs to be controlled. What are some good ways to prevent heart disease? Coronary artery disease is an example of a heart disease we would like to prevent. Exercise. Regular exercise is really important for preventing heart disease. A diet low in saturated fat. Avoiding trans fats, that's the hydrogenated oils that are very bad for us. Treating high blood pressure, because high blood pressure is associated with coronary artery disease. And remember how we talked about at the beginning of the class that foods, if you have a food that's a fat, like butter or vegetable oil or something like that, if this fat is solid at room temperature, then that is an easy way to tell it's a less healthy fat. If it's liquid at room temperature, like olive oil or canola oil, then that's a more healthy fat. It's a little bit of a trick to be able to tell how healthy a fat is. So can you find these things on a nutrition facts label? Now remember, the nutrition facts label is that little panel on the label that's specifically required and regulated by government laws and restrictions. So can you find this information on the nutrition facts label? The number of milligrams of calcium. Yes, you can find that on the nutrition facts label. The number of calories. Yes, you can find that on the nutrition facts label. The grams of protein. Yes, you can find that on the nutrition facts label. How about if the food is organic? No, you cannot find that on the nutrition facts label. This is going to be a little bit hard to see on your screen, but the last one is the percent daily values for a 3,000 calorie diet. Let me repeat that. The percent daily values for a 3,000 calorie diet. No, you cannot find that on the nutrition facts label. Why? Because the percent daily value is based on a 2,000 calorie diet, not a 3,000 calorie diet. 2,000 calorie diet is chosen because it's a very average number of calories that people might need. So they choose 2,000 calorie because it's a good one to choose. A lot of people need a 2,000 calorie diet. Well, we wouldn't do, percent daily value doesn't have anything to do with 3,000 calories. And the reason organic is not correct is because they can put on the label if something is organic if they meet the requirements. There's certain requirements that have to be met to call your food organic. So if they're met, they can put it on the label, but they don't put it on the nutrition facts label. They put it somewhere else. It's not on the nutrition facts label at all. This is something breast milk has that formula doesn't have. The answer to that question is antibodies. So antibodies from the mother will be made as she is fighting off diseases, right? As you live in the world as a human being, you're going to be making antibodies to the germs you're exposed to. So when a lactating mother is exposed to germs, they're going to make antibodies too. Those antibodies actually get into the breast milk, which is great because it helps prevent disease or help the baby fight disease. So it's going to be a gift to that baby. If the mother's exposed to the flu and she makes antibodies against the flu, then those go into the breast milk. The baby actually gets that when it's nursing, and the baby gets antibodies against the flu that it might not be able to make itself yet. It gets them from the mother. We can't produce that in formula. We would love to be able to produce that in formula, but we are not to the point scientifically where we could do that. So this is one of the reasons breast milk is better than formula. And what is the best food for babies? That would be breast milk. Breast milk is the best. But not every mother can breastfeed. Some have medical reasons they can't breastfeed. Some have personal reasons they can't breastfeed. And they can certainly feed their babies with formula as long as it's commercially prepared formula intended for human babies. We do not want anybody feeding their baby cow's milk or goat's milk. That's for cows or goats, or soy milk. Those are not for babies. We want them to feed babies commercially prepared formula or breast milk. A big reason working moms quit breastfeeding. What's a big reason they quit breastfeeding? Because we know they quit at higher rates than moms who are staying home or who have a long maternity leave. Why do they quit? Well, they have trouble pumping their breast milk. Either they have no place to do it or no time, and if they're separated from their babies, right? Usually, almost never does the baby come to work and actually nurse. So they have to pump their breast milk, but they may have no place to do it, no time to do it, or some other problem with it. So what can we do to try to help with this? Well, one thing we've done is there was a law passed, the Affordable Care Act, that required that there be a place to pump breast milk and required that they be given time to pump their milk for the baby. However, there may be state laws that are even more mandating that workplaces have a place or a time or some increased legislation to try to make sure that mothers get a chance to do what they need to do to feed their babies. But we as leaders, as co-workers, as educated people can also try to make sure that the laws are being followed and that we're being sensitive to try to make this easy on the working mother. Because remember, if you have a coworker, an employee, a friend, or whatever who is breastfeeding a baby, this is a temporary situation. This is something they're going to need to do for a while. It is not going to go on forever. When they get back to work at the very beginning, when the baby is young and exclusively breastfeeding, that's the time they're going to need the most time to pump the milk, and it's going to be the hardest for them. Once things get a little bit clearer, and once the baby is not eating breast milk exclusively, things get a little bit easier. It's a little bit easier for them to get the breast milk pumped in a timely manner, and then also they get better at it. It's just easier over time. So this is not something they're going to need to do forever. This is just a short period of time. Most women do not breastfeed over a year for sure. So it's something that if we can help women continue to breastfeed, it's so good for their babies. Another benefit beyond just you're doing a nice thing for a brand new human being is that mother may miss work less if she is breastfeeding her baby. Why is that? Because of the antibodies that she's making and giving to her baby may not get sick as often. And mothers miss work because their babies are sick. They have to be out of work with the baby at home if the baby is sick. So if they don't have as much illness in their baby, then they're going to be able to be at work more, perhaps. So this is another benefit. This vitamin deficiency occurs a lot in the elderly. That's vitamin B12 deficiency because as humans age, they're less able to absorb vitamin B12, and so they're more at risk for deficiency. Okay, so that's all of the review questions. I would like to point out to you, remember as you're studying that in this class, it's very practical. If you see things that sound like they would matter to your future, I'm very likely to ask about that. I'm very likely to ask questions about what vitamins and minerals do, or do you need this in order to have a healthy diet? I'm less likely to ask questions that are just science questions, although I ask them sometimes. But I'm less likely to ask those because I'm trying to make the class very, very practical and to kind of encourage you to delve into the science more in the future. But I'm less likely to ask a question about the structure of carbohydrates. I'm more likely to ask you a question about why are carbohydrates important and how they're used in the body. So as you're studying, remember that. If there's anything you have not understood, please look over that again. Be sure to look over these review questions. Also look over your questions that you've done in your assignments, not just those questions, but those topics. So there might be a question about osteoporosis in your assignment. Read about osteoporosis or review about osteoporosis, not just that one question, but all of it. Review that issue because it's been brought up many times in this class, right? It's likely to get brought up on your final exam. So not only would you want to know that calcium and vitamin D, calcium and vitamin D are important for that, you'd want to know that menopausal women are at risk. You'd want to know that preventing osteoporosis is important and women should be screened at middle age to see if they might benefit from treatment and that there's medications for that. You might want to know exercise decreases the risk of osteoporosis. You might want to know who's most at risk in terms of ethnicity. That would be white and Asian women are most at risk. So if you can study about the topic a little bit or know where that information is in your notes or in the lectures or in your book, then that's going to help you on the test. So not just the questions, but the topics. Remember to use your resources when you're taking the test. It is open book. There's no reason that you shouldn't be using those resources. Sometimes I see people have taken the test really fast. Sometimes they do okay and take the test really fast. Other times I'm like, I wonder if they look that up. So it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with the book, where things are in the book, with your lectures before you take this test so you know where things are if you do need to look something up. Okay, make sure that you do your questions for this lecture as well as all the previous lectures. Like, make sure you've done all of those. If you've been given an extension, make sure you've done all of your assignments. And then remember that we do have some other assignments due at the end of the class, the reflection paper, etc. Make sure you've done all of that, okay? And hopefully then you will have a good end of the course and finish up this final exam and do really well. I've really enjoyed teaching you this semester. Thank you.